Hi guys, on the 16th of July I had the pleasure of giving a talk at the National Army Museum in London about the Vickers gun and indirect fire. So I hope you find this interesting. I certainly enjoy giving the talk.
Okay then, we'll make a start. Good afternoon, my name's Matthew Moss. I'm a historian that focuses on small arms, and today I'm going to be talking about the Vickers Machine Gun and indirect fire. But I'm also a member of the Vickers MG Research Collection and Association, which is the organisation which has put on today's event. And one of the things I want to talk about today is the importance of the Vickers machine gun and its main party trick, which is essentially indirect fire. And first, before I begin, I'll talk a little bit about what the Vickers is and how it works. So the Vickers gun is a water-cooled, belt-fed, recoil-operated machine gun, and it's capable of firing around 500 rounds per minute for a prolonged period. And that's where it becomes extremely useful in this indirect fire role. It first entered service with the British Army in 1912, succeeding the Maxim gun, and it was primarily used as a direct and indirect support weapon. So what is indirect fire? Now this is a really simple diagram from a British Army small arms training manual. And unlike direct fire, where the weapon is aimed directly at its target, indirect fire sees the gun aimed almost like a howitzer, like artillery. And the rounds will be fired in an arc over the battlefield, down onto their target. And we can see this in the diagram. More often than not, the target that the guns were aimed at couldn't be seen directly from the gun. And they were normally enveloped by what was known as a beaten zone of the rounds falling in the area that the target was placed at. Typically, the aim was not to solely kill the enemy, but it was to interdict their movement, keep them pinned down, and basically harass them. So, into the crucible of the First World War, this is where the Vickers comes into its own. At the start of the First World War, the British Army, the infantry battalions were equipped with just 2 machine guns, Maxims and then Vickers when they became available. And it's fair to say that the capabilities of the Vickers had not yet been fully realised. By the end of the war, however, an expert corps of machine gunners, aptly called the Machine Gun Corps, had been formed, and the machine gun became one of the weapons which dominated the battlefield. And of course, it's the Vickers and the German Maxim are synonymous now with the First World War. The Machine Gun Corps itself was raised to provide a skilled corps of machine gunners that could support the British Army in the field, but they also helped shape the doctrine of the gun's use as well. While the concept of indirect fire wasn't new, it had initially emerged during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-1905, and the British Army had people in the field observing this conflict, and they'd reported back on this, but it wasn't fully adopted into the British Army until during the actual First World War. The idea wasn't fully embraced, in fact, until 1916. And the exact science behind indirect fire is quite complicated, a little too complicated for me to go into in depth today. So I would highly recommend that you, I think somewhere, definitely on the Vickers MGCA Association's website, there is a fantastic new edition of the Vickers Machine Gun, the Pride of the MGs. And there is an entire chapter that goes into depth on how indirect fire works. But to sum it up, the methods used by the artillery were examined by members of the Machine Gun Corps, and they were transferred across to the Vickers gun. This meant that they took not only the techniques that the artillery had developed for firing at targets in an extreme range and out of sight, it also meant that some of the equipment that they used came across as well. So things like a clinometer, difficult to pronounce, but a clinometer, which was used to measure the angle that the gun was set up on its tripod. For visible targets, a rangefinder could be used, typically a bar and Stroud. There is actually one outside, World War II model, which was used during the Second War. And these were used to measure the distance of targets which could be observed. And if they couldn't see the target itself, which was often the case. For indirect fire, what they would do is they would conduct the fire by maps or fire charts, and it became a bit of an exact science in this regard. Indirect fire was so important to the British Army that during the Machine Gun Corps officer training course, a total amount of at least a good portion of the last 2 weeks of an 8-week course were dedicated across to it. So it was an extremely important aspect for the officers of the Machine Gun Corps to understand and be able to direct their fire in a very targeted manner. Perhaps the most famous use of indirect fire came during the Somme, when the 100th Machine Gun Corps fired just short of around 100,000 rounds at high wood. Now, this is often cited as being 1 million rounds, fired in about 12 hours of fire. But Rich Fisher, our director of the association, has done some research on this, looked into the logistics. And while the original account from the 100th Machine Gun Company's commander states that they had men working round the clock to fill belts, using up all available water, the logistics behind that, keeping that company of 16 guns filled with water, filled with ammunition, is just too much. And looking back through war diaries, we've managed to work out that just short of 100,000 rounds, I think it was 95,200, which were fired during that 12 hours, which is no less impressive in my book. I think that's not quite 1 million, but still 100,000 rounds from one company is quite something. The company's commander on the day described that barrage as being annihilating. So I've got a little clip here from, this is from Kitchener's Great Army, a Malins film. And we can see a number of Vickers guns being set up here. There's the tripod being set up. And then we get some great footage of some chaps engaged in barrage fire. So you can see here the angle that the guns were set up on. And this would have been fired at around 2,000 yards maximum. A year later, during the Battle of Vimy Ridge, an even larger barrage was undertaken with the entire Canadian Machine Gun Corps joined by elements of the British Army's Machine Gun Corps to muster some 230 Vickers guns, firing in support of an attack on the ridge. No less than 5 million rounds were stockpiled for the guns for this operation. So moving on, pepper pots. Anyone know what a pepper pot is? Anyone heard that term before? No? Well, you'll find this next bit fairly informative then, hopefully. So, during the Second World War, the Vickers came back into its own, essentially. And indirect fire became even more sophisticated with specialist equipment developed. This photograph shows some of the first Manchesters in Malaya in 1941. They're not engaged in indirect fire here, but it's a great photograph and I couldn't really resist putting it in. So after the end of the First World War, the Machine Gun Corps was disbanded in 1922. In fact, it was the centennial of that disbandment yesterday, and that's what this series of events has been to commemorate. The expertise and doctrine that the Machine Gun Corps developed during the First War was retained, that corporate knowledge was maintained, and in 1937 it was decided to reform some dedicated battalions of machine gun armed units. The machine gun battalions were formed and they saw action throughout the Second World War. The Vickers and its capability to direct indirect fire once again came into its own, and the development of new and improved rounds, such as the Mark 8Z, saw the range of the guns actually increased to 4,500 yards. This allowed the range of the guns to be kept, This range allowed the guns to be kept well back from the immediate front line, allowing them to drop fire onto enemy positions without themselves being in immediate danger from counter-battery fire. The new ammunition, coupled with new equipment such as the dial sight, which you'll see on a number of the guns outside. There's one at the top of the stairs there with a dial sight, and there's a 1960s example as well upstairs with the dial sight mounted. These enabled the machine gun battalions to accurately pour supporting fire from a considerable distance. This photograph shows a section of the 2nd Middlesex Regiment during Operation Market Garden at the Mashfield Canal on the 20th of September. So here you can see there are a section of 4 guns. It was 4 guns per section. And they're all equipped with the dial sight. So you can see the dial sight, which is just on the top of the side of the gun there. And that allowed indirect fire aiming to be done with a little more ease than using a clinometer. So the barrages would be pre-planned and coordinated on a map or fire control chart. The guns would be set up to create an overlapping beaten zone encompassing the targets. Depending on the range and the terrain, this beaten zone could span up to about 300, 400 yards, depending on again, range. But the main thing with the beaten zone is that was kept under constant fire. So enemy forces within the area, the movement was interdicted and harassed. So while an artillery barrage might be more targeted at targets, the Vickers and its indirect role aim to keep a certain area under constant long-term interdiction. Perhaps the most significant use of indirect fire with the Vickers came in March 1945 with Operation Veritable, part of the Western Allies' invasion of Germany. During the Rhineland campaign, the guns carried out a type of bombardment called the pepper pot. As part of preliminary bombardments by artillery, these pepper pots were organised to include all available firepower from the division. They consisted of the division's machine gun battalion and their 3 companies, as well as mortars and other elements such as anti-aircraft guns and anti-tank weapons as well. These weapons were the pot, and the fire that they poured was the pepper, and the Vickers gun provided the smallest grains of that pepper that they were sprinkling onto enemy targets. The task was to thoroughly saturate enemy positions and defences before the launch of the attack. During Veritable, 96 Vickers guns on the left flank of the front line fired a total of 1.3 million rounds during the initial bombardment of enemy positions. The water-cooled Vickers was well suited to this, and fire could be kept up for a significant amount of time. As long as the guns were fed with ammunition and water to keep them cool, they could keep up a barrage rate of 25 rounds every 30 seconds, until the guns had to be checked at 10,000 rounds. So at 10,000 rounds, the guns would be checked and their barrels would be changed. During the First War, it was found that any gun that had fired more than 8,000 rounds, it was best not to be used for indirect fire, especially in terms of what was known as overhead fire. Overhead fire typically was fired over the heads of troops. So they found that barrels that were a little more worn, it was probably a better idea not to use those when friendly troops were almost in the line of fire. So with overhead fire, which was used during both wars, the rounds would fire over the battlefield and arc just as they do with indirect fire. But of course, it's covering in advance of troops in contact. 30 Corps' after-action report on Veritable noted, all accounts show that the pepper pot justified the apparent heavy expenditure of ammunition and was a definite factor in the success of the general fire plan. So it was believed that it wasn't the size of the shells that were falling on the enemy, but the number of rounds and the prolonged amount of fire that was falling onto them that were key. So in this clip here, sadly we have no sound, is from a newsreel, and it shows what one of these pepper pots would have been like. So this was filmed during Operation Veritable in March 1945. So here you can see some of the Vickers guns in action with indirect fire, and then they're coupled with the other elements of the division's firepower. So 40mm Bofors would have been used, 75mm anti-tank guns, any attached armour, 75mm guns on Shermans and other British tanks would have been used, as well as, there's a really great clip at the end of this of some self-propelled Archer anti-tank guns as well. There we go. So, Lieutenant Colonel E.G. Johnson, commander of the Toronto Scottish, a machine gun battalion with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, organised their division's pepperpot fire plan. He later explained that the fire was to be as irregular as possible. The effect of having deliberate erratic fire come down meant the enemy could not know when it would stop and when it would start. And this had the desired effect of reducing his morale. It served as a strong deterrent to free movement by the enemy. Johnson described many of the prisoners captured by the division's initial advance as being completely addled by the bombardment. Indeed, the Canadian Army's first intelligence report noted that captured German troops said the bombardment put a prolonged strain on the nerves. They had an impression of an overwhelming force opposed to them, which to their isolated state they felt was useless to resist. Last spring, we had the opportunity to recreate a section of Vickers machine guns firing in the field, and we got some great footage. Now, again, there's no sound in this because we don't have sound, but at the end, if you want to make machine gun noises, you can do. So this shows a section of 4 Vickers machine guns dug in as they would have been on the day during the battle. Oh, we have sound. So, didn't get to hear your machine gun sounds, but never mind. Basically, what this drone footage shows, if we play that again, is the 4 guns dug in as they would have been in the V-shaped slit trenches with overhead cover as well. And this is fairly typical. They're spaced at 25 yards, as they would have been. And on the day, we were firing blank, just as a demonstration. And that's why we have some of these stoppages, because the blank didn't quite have the power to drive through the belts, which are a little bit swollen from the rain on the day. So to compare that, we have a photograph from the actual operation itself, and you can see just how close we managed to recreate those positions. So you've got the overhead cover there at the back, you've got the chap manning the gun with the dial sight on the side there, you've got lots and lots of empty belts from the barrage fire that's going on, and you've got his number 2 there feeding the belts from the side. The machine gun battalions continued to support the advance through the Rhineland, and several weeks later, the pepperpot bombardment, ahead of the launch of Operation Plunder, saw the 2nd Battalion Middlesex Regiment fire a total of 304,000 rounds during one bombardment. During the fighting near Emmerich, the battalion's machine gun companies fired a staggering 675,000 rounds during 4 days of continuous slow-rate fire. By the end of this, the battalion's official history noted that some of the guns were almost falling to pieces. Lieutenant Reginald Fendick, a Canadian officer on loan to the 2nd Middlesex, recalled in his book, which we have copies of on the association's website, which we just reprinted, recalled that the guns were only out of action while moving to a new position. Night and day, there have been shoots, recce's, and moves over tracks deep in mud, a lot of shelling and mines all over the place, and the rain had been continuous. So it's very difficult circumstances to be operating under, and you can see a little bit of this from this photograph. It's quite muddy. Pepperpot Barrage, in support of Plunder, the operations across the Rhine included 3 machine gun battalions, a tank battalion, 2 anti-tank battalions, and 3 light anti-aircraft battalions. So those would have been the 40mm Bofors that you saw in that clip earlier. These were all tasked with firing on German positions, and this amounted to some 22 75mm tank guns, 48 17-pounder anti-tank guns, 72 Bofors guns, 36 4.2-inch mortars, and 108 Vickers machine guns. So that gives you an idea of the truly huge volume of fire that's involved with these pepperpot bombardments. So moving on, the Korean War. The Korean War is sort of the last hurrah of the Vickers in the indirect fire role. And here we've got a gun from the Royal Ulster Rifles, in Korea in, I believe, 1951-52. At this point, the machine gun battalions had been disbanded once again. And after the Second World War, those dedicated battalions were re-rolled back to infantry. And the Vickers machine guns were reallocated to the support companies of those battalions. Each support company had a 6-gun medium machine gun platoon, so that's a massive reduction of firepower from those machine gun battalions. But the idea was that it would be a more organic support they could call on at the battalion level rather than brigade or division. But in 1947, the guns themselves were actually removed from service with the regular army. Of course, they were retained with the territorials. But this rapidly changed in 1950 with the outbreak of the Korean War, and it was quickly realized that there was a weight of fire needed for the kind of operations they were engaged in, many of them relatively defensive in nature, with what were regularly termed as human wave attacks by the Chinese, although the technique that they used was more of a focused movement of manpower into a certain area rather than just a generic human wave. The training manuals for the Vickers have been rewritten after the war, and they've been simplified somewhat. So this meant that a lot of the indirect fire corporate knowledge from the machine gun battalions wasn't included in those manuals. But with troops on the ground in Korea, it was quickly realized and requests were sent back asking that indirect fire be reintegrated into the training course for the Vickers gun. So the techniques were reappraised and added back into a new set of manuals which were prepared in 1951. So here we've got a photograph of the first King's Own Scottish borderers training on a Vickers in Korea. And you can see again that dial sight is mounted. And whenever you see the dial sight mounted, that's a clear indication that indirect fire is the role that they're tasked with rather than a direct support. Of course, during the Korean War, there was plenty of direct fire support that was provided by these support companies of the medium machine guns, which involves firing directly at the enemy rather than indirectly. The Vickers gun was put to good use at the Battle of Indian River by the Gloucesters. Similarly, the Duke of Wellington's regiment, their machine gun support platoon was used in the indirect fire role at the battles of the Hook, the second and third battles of the Hook in 1952 and 53. This is a great colorized photograph of the 2nd Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry in March 1951. And you can see here the difficulty they had in actually digging the guns into positions due to the frozen ground. So they've basically dug themselves a scrape and they're having a nap. Judging by the amount of spent brass beneath the gun there, it looks like they've earned the nap. The Vickers was used by other Commonwealth nations during the Korean War as well, the Australians and of course the Canadians, with accounts of the 2nd Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry using indirect fire at the Battle of Kapyong. Korea represented one of the last times that the Vickers was used in the indirect fire role, but it did remain in British service alongside its successor, the L7 GPMG, until 1968. And there's some corps had them retained in store until the early 70s. So there we go. That's indirect fire with the Vickers gun. If you have any questions, I can try and answer them, and if I don't know the answer, I will refer you to someone who does. Thank you.
Did they have any mechanical aid for loading those belts, or was there a bunch of squaddies behind the scenes furiously stuffing cartridges in them?
So, from the same Malins film, I don't have it with me, I'm afraid. There's some great footage of some chaps sat on a limber, like the one we have at the front there, and one chap's filling a hopper with rounds, and it's cranked. So it was a belt filling machine in that respect. By the Second World War in Korea, the ammunition was coming in filled boxes, ready from the factory. There was some filling in the field done, no doubt, but typically it was in ready-made lighters. Yes, sir?
Could you talk about the variation in muzzles? I noticed that the early ones
Yeah.
got very simple muzzles. The latest ones have got a...
Yeah, that's preliminarily predominantly a flash hider. That bulbous shape at the end of the later photographs, I think,
And also the water jackets.
in that one. So that's the flash hider there. The water jackets, I want to say corrugated. Is that the correct term, Rich? Fluted. There we are. The fluted water jacket. That was typically seen on First World War guns. Second World War gun production guns were typically a smooth.
What about the canvas? What's that for?
Carrying when hot,
Okay.
essentially.
How long would the water last in the tank if it wasn't topped up?
I believe it's 600 rounds it boils at. Is that right, Rich? 600?
Yeah, because I think what you've got is this barrel casing gets filled up here.
Yep.
Yep.
And then this holds 7.5 pints, and that boils up after 600 rounds. So at the rapid rate.
So I was right.
And then you lose a pint and a half of water for every 1,000 rounds. So at the rapid rate. So if you slow down your rate of fire, it will last forever potentially because it won't boil up. If you're firing at that rapid rate, with just 2 seconds between bursts, about every minute, you'll lose that within 5,000 rounds of fire.
And that's for condensate.
Yeah, so then the steam goes down the tube, sorry, in front of things, steam goes down that black tube into the can, which isn't necessarily to save water, it's to stop the steam giving your position away.
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah.
Was there anything on that fellow to tell you when it was running dry, or was it just you keep your eye on?
Yeah, so between changing ammunition belts and stuff like that, if the number 2 is doing that, or they're having a rest, they'd be checking those water levels, but not too much because if you have a look on the guns out there, that rear filling plug is brass. It's gonna, you're not going to be wanting to undo that very often because it gets extremely hot at that point, and you don't want a face full of steam if it is steaming up. So when you let the gun cool down, or you're going to change the barrel or something every 10,000 rounds, then you'd be checking those water levels quite often.
Also worth mentioning that in Korea especially, they used a mix of antifreeze as well,
Yes,
didn't
they do. So they put glycol and stuff in there as
Yeah.
well. So, they need to keep everything moving. Obviously, if that water freezes when that's full, it either holds the barrel in place so recoil doesn't work, or just breaks the gun.
Yes, sir.
Did the Germans have a similar thing with pepper pot? Did they use similar?
I don't believe they did. No, I mean the Germans tended to use the MG42 and their more general purpose machine guns in a more section-based role as a direct suppression weapon. So they tended not to. They did have the Lafayette mount, which was for sustained fire, but that wasn't typically used for indirect fire.
Is that purely because they didn't have enough weapons to
They had enough weapons to do so, but I think it just wasn't within their doctrine. It wasn't something that they felt was necessary. They were suppressing at those kind of ranges, 4,000 yards outwards, with mortars.
Yeah. So the Germans push forward mortars and like artillery, naval Werfer, stuff like that.
Yeah.
A lot further forward. Whereas we supplement some of that with machine guns. They don't. It's a different kind of doctrine. Doesn't necessarily have a reason. It's just a different way of doing things.
I mean, the Germans suffered because of that, or they thought it didn't matter.
No, it's not. It's one of those sort of sub-levels of doctrine that would have had a tactical consequence in particular battles, but their mortars and stuff remedied that so much.
I heard a story that when the gun went out of service, that a trial was done where a gun was run continuously for a million rounds and it didn't jam.
So that's in the 60s, and one of the last armourers courses on the guns they put a single gun ran for 7 days, fired around 7 million rounds. Yeah, around 7 million rounds, and they had minor breakages. So they did have minor breakages, but they ran it, kept it topped up with water, put new barrels in, just kept it running for 7 days. I could assure we've fired the Vickers a lot. You do get bored at some point.
Do you think they used the screwdriver trick?
Possibly, yeah, just probably those guys there. You do get bored at some point. They got bored. It was one of the guys who's still around that did that.
And it was 7 million rounds.
7 million rounds, yeah.
What was the cost
time of the First World War?
Of the gun?
Around £115, if I remember rightly, compared to a Lewis, which is around 50 or 75. By the end of the war, they've reduced it to, if I remember right, they've reduced it around to £95 by doing less machining and less fettling. So you see the different barrel casings, as you talked about. That's the fluted one, that's a Great War era gun. The smooth barrel casing is a cheaper way of producing it. So it's things like that to bring costs down into manufacture and also speed up the rate of manufacture as well.
Yeah.
Where were they made? By Vickers? All
Yep.
made by Vickers?
Yep.
What?
Everything Brayford. Everything Brayford.
Oh, right.
So they're the old Maxim and Nordenfeld factories that they turned over to machine guns. The Crayford factory was built in 1917, but they largely produced oil and cap. So the Newcastle factory produces some parts, the factory in Bath produces some parts, but largely they're made in those two locations.
Which is where the Vickers hardness testing machine was
Yep.
made. Subsequently.
Yeah.
It's obviously easy to see where an artillery shell falls and then adjust. Was there a doctrine working with forward observers to bring a bullet, which is very hard to see at distance, on the target?
There's accounts in Korea with direct fire of them not being able to use the guns exactly for that because they didn't have any trace from the belts. But in terms of forward observers, I think so. Is that
No,
right?
they didn't. So they left those to mortars. We were having this conversation yesterday, actually, in terms of there's a lot of trust. So you trust in the training, that people know what they're doing. You trust in the equipment, it's going to say that it's going to do what you want it to do, and you trust in the science that proves that what happens, it's physics. It doesn't vary too much, but that's where you get the range tables, the slide rules, and everything to turn around and say, there are lots of numbers that relate to how this works, and officers would have. We've got a slide rule actually that shows some of that stuff upstairs. They're calculations they would have to trust in, and there's one of the reasons that I think we don't do a lot of this stuff today is because there's that, or we want to move to having forward observation officers, tracer rounds that are more effective, observation rounds and things like that. It's because the risk that we're prepared to accept is a lot less. So in terms of taking that machine gunnery transition all the way to how we manage machine gunnery today, is that actually the risk that we're able to accept around our elements of trust is a lot less.
If your soldiers are in that bottom line,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, in overhead
need
fire.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I undersold just how simple that diagram makes it look.
Can you talk a little bit about how you got the thing at Bisley that many of us have probably seen on YouTube? How you managed to arrange and get that actually happening?
I'll save that for another day,
Okay.
I'm afraid. because
There's going to be a live stream. You're going to do a live
that's
stream
gonna be
Q&A,
live
aren't you?
stream of Probably an hour and a bit in terms of the process of that. But not easily is the quick answer.
Were there any attempts prior to the adoption of the Mark 8Z ammunition at increasing the range of the round for the Vickers?
Lots of attempts. I mean, the Mark 8Z ammunition that gets introduced takes 20 years to develop. There's lots of the small arms committee minutes, the Ordnance Board memoranda are absolutely stacked full of all of the different ammunition trials and stuff of how we can eke that out. But all things in the 20s and 30s happened slowly until the end of the 30s when there's a war coming and everybody goes, oh, well, we need to settle on something, let's get it done. So that's where the Mark 8Z probably comes. Might not have been able to get better. I don't think could have done actually, looking at some of the stuff that happened to 762. But they tried, they didn't dramatically, or they didn't make sufficient impact. An extra 1,600 yards, people were happy with going, yeah, let's go with that.
Yeah, the increase from 303 to Mark 8Z it's significant, isn't it? It's 4,500 yards, which is 3 miles. Yeah,
it's half again.
Yeah. Was there another question at the back there?
Sorry, I don't know if I missed something earlier, but you talked about like pepper pots.
Yes.
Machine guns were a complement to higher caliber weapons.
Indeed.
Would you ever use machine gun on its own for an aerial fire?
For what sort of fire, sorry?
Or indirect aerial fire?
Aerial fire.
You said about the pepper pots.
Yeah.
Machine guns complemented higher caliber artillery.
All right, yeah.
Bits and pieces.
Oh, so do you mean whether
On its
it
own.
be used
Yeah,
on its own? Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So that photograph of from Operation Market Garden, that section of machine guns supporting the crossing, I think that particular barrage was done with support of just mortars, I believe, from reading around it. So yeah, they definitely did fire on their own. I mean, those big pepper plot operations and barrages were all planned out for major operations like crossing the Rhine, etc., and Operation Market Garden had a number of them as well. But the term is more used around Veritable and that kind of period.
So largely, pepper pot doesn't come in until that late 44, 45. Before that, machine gun battalions.
They're just doing
their thing.
their own fire
with some mortars,
missions.
because they've got their own intrinsic mortars as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, largely machine gun stuff on the road, which means you can't see where that barrage is falling, quite principally, because there's no big shell fire to give it away. So then the next talk's going to run at 2 o'clock, and that is Paul Macro talking about men's motorcycles and machine guns in Northwest Frontier. So actually something very niche, but something we haven't covered because nobody's lent us a motorcycle in a time. So we'll cover it in PowerPoint today. Like we couldn't cover indirect fire today because the buildings would get in the way.
Chelsea wouldn't like it, would they? Thank you.
Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you found that interesting. Thank you to Rich for jumping in at the end there to help me answer some of the questions. And special thanks to Adam Blackmore-Heel for recording the talk for me. I've dropped a link to his channel in the description box below. Don't forget to check out my videos from the shoot at Bisley and my walk around video on the event at the National Army Museum, where I show some of the displays that were set up. Thanks again for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share the video and subscribe. Thanks again for watching. Catch you next time.